Okay, perfect. Um, Hello everyone. Audio check as usual. Can you guys hear me over on Zoom? Oh, shoot. Hello, just wanted to check if the audio is working for everyone on Zoom. Maybe if someone can drop a comment, just want to make sure. Are we good? Oh, okay, perfect. Okay. Hi everyone. This has been a wider gap than usual. 2 weeks ago, I took a break. Last week we were supposed to meet, but it was flooding. It actually didn't turn out to be too bad over here, but it was pretty bad in Brooklyn and Queens. So I think we've delayed it till today. I don't know if you guys can see what's in my hand. I have Bang Bang chocolate right now. Courtesy of Rachel, she brought some. So to those of you who didn't come today, you guys are missing out. You chose the worst day to not show up. With that out of the way, let's get started with our lesson for today. Okay, so it's been a while. I know it's been 2 or 3 weeks ago. We left off with the Indish party, right? Which was sort of the first explicitly nationalist party movement. It wasn't Indonesia yet at the time, it was still the Indies. And they sort of outlined this concept that all the Indies is one sort of social entity. Everyone who lives there is one people, and that it should fight for independence. Again, you replace Indies with Indonesia, and you already have sort of like all the necessary elements in place. So we're gonna take off from here and see how this slowly develops over the course of the early 20th century. So this is the period where, if you're Indonesian, you'll know this as Kebangkitan Nasional, National Awakening, and you kind of see this this sort of like expansion of political organizations. The famous ones are Sarekat Islam. It's like an Islamic trade organization, and PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party. And we won't go into them in too much depth. We'll cover that eventually in the fourth module. For now, the important thing is that a lot of these movements got increasingly more and more violent. And the really big one here was the PKI. They started the Indonesian Communist Party, and they led a bunch of anti-Dutch revolts in the 1920s. And again, remember the big historical moment in world history at this point, 1917, the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks take over and they establish the Soviet Union. And this provides like an injection, basically, to all the communist movements around the world, and especially later with the establishment of the Comintern. This was crushed by the Dutch, and the Dutch state became increasingly repressive. So the English party founders we talked about last few weeks ago, Cipto Mangunkusumo, Dufus Dekker, and Ki Hajar Dewantara, all of them were imprisoned, eventually exiled to the Netherlands. And the Dutch even built this infamous internment, some even call it a concentration camp, Boven Digul, which was located like far in a very isolated part of Indonesia, in Papua, all the way to the east. It was made to house the PKI, sort of like dissidents. But I want to highlight that all of these movements, Sarekat Islam, PKI, they were not explicitly nationalist. They did not say we were going to build an independent Indonesian state. They were anti-Dutch, but they were not nationalist. An example of that would be like PKI. PKI said PKI was anti-Dutch, but PKI wanted to build a communist sort of state, not necessarily an Indonesian state. And so that's an important distinction we're going to make, especially as we move on with the 20s, where we start seeing more and more explicit declarations of Indonesian independence. And now again, the word Indonesia starts coming into the picture. It's not Indies anymore. For example, in 1925, the Comintern agent Tan Malaka, he publishes this book Narda Republik Indonesia, which is actually the first to sort of promote this idea of an independent republic of Indonesia. Muhammad Hatta, Indonesia's first vice president later, 1927, defends himself in court, publishes sort of like makes a similar manifesto of independence, Indonesia Brij, Indonesia Free. And finally, the text that we'll be covering over the next few weeks, Sukarno's Indonesia Menggugat, Indonesia Accuses. So let's talk a bit about Sukarno, because pretty pivotal figure, and we're going to be spending a lot of time with him. He's Indonesia's first president. He's sort of born to a Javanese school teacher, and his mother is Balinese. And so this sort of exposure to Javanese village life sort of gave him, like, really colored his worldview and sort of gave him a certain attachment to the Javanese masses, which we'll see coming forward. And you want to think of Sukarno, like at this period, Indonesia wasn't the only anti-colonial nationalist movements. We're seeing this all over the world. And each of these movements have these very charismatic leaders, right? Which you just associate with them, like symbolizing the idea of nationalism of that country. For India, for example, it would be Gandhi or Nehru. In China, it's Sun Yat-sen. In Ghana, it's Kwame Nkrumah. For Indonesia, that's Sukarno. And why did Sukarno play such an important role? Why was he so central? Part of it was he was an extraordinary orator. He was one of the most charismatic speakers in world history, probably. I was speaking with this older Indonesian man. He's probably above 70, 80 right now. He lived through the Dutch occupation, he lived through the Japanese, and he lived through independence. And he was telling me stories about how during this period, Indonesians would all gather around the radio whenever they heard Sukarno wanted to speak. Like it was like waiting for a concert almost. And he remembered saying that I felt proud listening to this. And there were always these decisive moments in Indonesian history where all the different factions of independence were sort of fighting each other. And what would end it? Sukarno would come up to the radio and he'd give one of his speeches where it's like, but remember, we're sort of Indonesian. And that would often like actually work in stopping the conflict, especially during the War of Independence. And that's one reason why we're talking about Sukarno today, not Tan Malaka and not Hatta, because Sukarno, more so than any of these leaders, exemplified Indonesian nationalism itself. He has this very famous line where he's like, don't be an Arabic Muslim, don't be a European Christian, be an Indonesian Muslim, be an Indonesian Christian. And so he sort of exemplified this idea that there was an innate Indonesianness under which all the other political ideologies, all the other political identities can sort of be grouped under. So that's Sukarno. Let's get to know the man a little bit because he's a character. This is taken from his autobiography. He narrated it to Cindy Adams, who was an American journalist. He basically just talks to her and she transcribes this. And this is literally how he describes himself. These are his own words. This is him describing himself. The simplest way to describe Sukarno, he refers to himself in the third person, is to say that he is a great lover. He loves his country, he loves his people, he loves women, he loves art, and he's very honest. Best of all, he loves himself. Man of feeling, an appreciator. And in this other line, he's talking about himself. How else could I have become the great leader of the revolution? People call themselves all sorts of things. Sukarno calls himself the great leader of the revolution. And again, he's not humble at all. He's, I made a revolution. I created this one country. I beat the Dutch. It was all me. The interesting thing, though, is sort of his connection of this to this idea of art, this idea of artistry, right? He thinks of himself as a man of feeling. And it's this sentimentality, it's this artistry that makes revolution possible, that makes revolution important. And there's this kind of cute statement, which I think Indonesians will appreciate. He links emotionality not just as something that's necessary for revolution, but as something that is fundamentally Indonesian. Indonesians are very emotional. What's the evidence? The guling. And Indonesians will know this, right? We have a very special pillow that's just meant for hugging. You have the standard thing, it's on your head. You have this bolster, and you hug it. And Sukarno is sort of pointing out to that. Another thing, call back to 3 weeks ago, we were talking about this class that would lead sort of the independence movement. That was sort of a class that was sort of trapped in between worlds. They weren't Dutch, they were sort of native, but they were brought up in this Dutch educational system. Sukarno is very much part of that class. His line here is very indicative. Dutch became the language in which I did my thinking. Even today, I automatically curse in Dutch. And when I pray to God, I pray in Dutch. Not Malay, not Indonesian, not Javanese, Dutch. Sukarno did not just love himself. Sukarno loved a lot of fleshly pleasures. This is sort of a list of all of his wives from Wikipedia. And interestingly, he started marrying and divorcing them more in after 1958, which is when he started becoming more and more powerful. There's a link there. Apparently, might be apocryphal, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's quite funny. The CIA and the KGB once tried to ensnare Sukarno by trying to record an adult video, essentially. And apparently, when Sukarno found out, he was like, "Can I have a copy?" So that's him. This was sort of him when he was imprisoned for the first time. Of course, it broke him. Why? Because again, very honest guy. I am a Sybarite. I am a man who gratifies his senses. I enjoy fine clothes, exciting foods, love making, and I could not take the isolation of prison life. And when the door closed, he said, "You're trapped, Sukarno. Trapped." So that's Sukarno. We'll be spending the next few weeks with him. Let's move on to the text itself, Indonesia Menggugat. And there's an interesting play on terms here in terms of translation. Indonesia Menggugat. Menggugat is translated in English as to accuses. It's not a perfect translation. Menggugat has a very clear legal connotation, right? It's sort of a court term. Accuse doesn't. Accuse is very neutral. So you might say, why don't you just say Indonesia sues or Indonesia litigates? One, it doesn't quite have the same ring. There's no moral injunction the way Menggugat does, the way accuses does. It's just an interesting comment as to how like translation gets tricky sometimes, and sometimes you don't capture the full nuance of language when you translate it. But okay, let's get back to the text. So Sukarno founds the PNI, the Indonesian Nationalist Party, in 1927. It's kind of like the Indies Party. It sort of advocates for independence, but again, right now, no more Indies. It's Indonesia, right? Term has morphed. And Sukarno is the PNI is very aggressive. It takes a very confrontational posture with the Dutch. And this actually causes some rifts in the nationalist movement. Hatta and Sultan Syahrir, who were at the Netherlands at the time, didn't agree with this. And we'll talk about that later. But essentially, yeah, he was very aggressive. And because he was very aggressive, eventually the main founders of PNI were accused and imprisoned by the Dutch. And he was dragged out into the Dutch court in 1930. And sort of everyone knew the outcome. Sukarno knew the outcome. His allies knew the outcome. He was going to go to jail. The court case was just a formality. So what do you do in such a situation? Remember, Sukarno's a man of artistic feeling. Sukarno is a showman, and so he turns it into a spectacle. He turns it into theater. He walks into court and he presents himself not just as Sukarno, but as the voice of Indonesia. It's not Sukarno defending himself in court against the Dutch. It is Indonesia defending itself against the Dutch. And Indonesia's defense statement becomes a counter accusation against the Dutch. Indonesia accuses Indonesia Menggugat. And again, why are we exploring this through this text? Why not Tan Malaka's Narde Republik? Because that was the first time someone like forwarded this concept of a Republic of Indonesia. Why not just say that instead? Remember Benedict Anderson. We were talking about nationalism. We were talking about how nationalism sees itself as a Bildungsroman, a coming of age, a coming of consciousness, a journey where nations realize that they exist. Indonesia Menggugat is structured exactly like that. Indonesia Menggugat is not just a court case. It is basically a biography of Indonesia. And we see that in the structure of the text. Sukarno begins the first two sections with a very critical analysis of the Dutch colonial system and how that affects and transforms, again, not Indonesia yet at this time, life in the Indies. And in the third and fourth section, he talks about how this gives rise to political movements, articulating independence and eventually this idea of an Indonesian state, of an Indonesian republic. So that's what we're going to be talking about for the next few weeks. We're just going to cover this text. And because the structure of the text essentially it's basically autobiographical. It's a biography of Indonesia. It moves in lockstep with the history. So we'll be going back and forth between the text and between the actual historical exposition. So this week we'll be talking about this week, and the next we'll be talking about parts 1 and 2, and then finally the next week, the week after, parts 3 and 4. Okay. So how does Sukarno start? He starts with an analysis of capitalism and imperialism. But again, we have to remember the setting. PKI just launched a revolt against the Dutch government. You have the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. There was this atmosphere of anti-Marxist, anti-communist fear, paranoia. And again, in the earlier sections of the court case, PKI, the Communist Party, and Afdeling B is sort of like a communist Marxist affiliated section of Sarekat Islam, was mentioned. So that was on the minds of the Dutch prosecutors. Are you a Bolshevik? Are you a communist? And in this kind of environment, saying words like capitalism and imperialism, there makes you kind of a boogeyman. These are scare terms, words that must not be named. But Sukarno wants to launch his analysis with this. And so, and sort of the quotes here, again, as usual, Indonesian on the right, English on the left. So how does Sukarno try to navigate this sort of tricky political territory? And so he starts as capitalism, and we'll start to see why Sukarno is very careful here. Notice the definition. What is capitalism? It's a social system which arises from a mode of production which separates the workers from the means of production. And the surplus value does not fall into the hands of the workers, but into the hands of the capitalists. This is textbook Marxism. This is exactly Marx's definition of capitalism. Again, that's why Sukarno is sort of like, okay, how do I do this? How do I do this without sort of being branded sort of a Bolshevik? And he has an interesting strategy here. And he sort of builds up on this eventually. Capitalism is not any kind of government. Not a people, not a nation. I don't hate the Dutch government. I don't hate the Dutch nation. I don't hate the Dutch people. What is capitalism? It's a system. It's impersonal. It's a system. It's a concept. He'll develop this sooner in ways that are actually quite interesting. And it moves on to imperialism. And again, it's the same thing. It's no government. It's not a politician, not even a foreign people, but a hunger, a lust, a system. Again, that's the key word. It's a system for the domination of another people or nation's economic system. So again, capitalism and imperialism, it's not any person, it's not any government, it's a system. And imperialism is specifically economic in nature. You extract profit, you extract economic wealth from another nation's economic system. And he develops this idea of a system quite beautifully here. Imperialism is not solely the province of the white race. It's not a moral defect of whites. It's not that imperialism is a function of whites, because imperialism can be done by anyone. And his examples are fascinating. He talks about the Tatars in the 13th and 14th century. Basically, I think the Tatars, might be the Mongols. Actually, not sure, but actually, no, they're not. He talks about Mahmud of Ghazni, who basically conquered India. And then he talks about old Indonesian kingdoms too. He talks about Srivijaya. He talks about Majapahit. Srivijaya and Majapahit, in Sukarno's eyes, are also imperialists. And so, again, for Sukarno, it's not, I don't hate the Dutch. I'm not racist. I don't hate the Dutch nation. I don't hate the Dutch people. I don't hate the British. I don't hate the Americans. Who do I hate? I hate the system, imperialism. And my ancestors were also imperialists. You just happen to be the imperialist right now. That's the crux of his argument. It's a system. It's a way, it's a mode of living. It's a mode of acting. And he has this interesting idea where he sort of links imperialism to very specifically economic goals. I didn't put the quote up here, but essentially he argues that when people think about imperialism, what do they think? They think about direct conquest. The Dutch conquered and occupied Indonesia. Sukarno says that's not really the core essence of imperialism. The core essence is economic. So even if the Dutch never conquered Indonesia, but let's say impose an unfair trade deal to extract Indonesia's economic wealth, for Sukarno, that's also imperialism. So it's deeply tied. Imperialism is deeply economic in character, and that sets the stage for what we're going to talk about for the rest of this class and next week too. So he divides imperialism into two kinds, old and new, imperialisme tua dan baru. Tua is the imperialism of the all the various colonial companies, in this case, the VOC, the duchies in these companies from the 16th and 18th centuries. And then he talks so that, and then he distinguishes that from a different stage of imperialism, imperialisme baru, which is only in the 19th and 20th century, and that's intimately linked to modern capitalism. And so again, to sum up everything, imperialism is a system of profit extraction, and that's what we're going to focus on. The first two parts of Indonesia Menggugat are a critical analysis of the economic dimensions of imperialism, of Dutch colonialism, and that's what we're going to unpack. And today we're going to focus on old imperialism, and we'll start transitioning to new imperialism next week. So, okay, just to sort of hammer the point home, there's sort of this narrative in Indonesia. The Dutch were with us, were sort of conquered us for 300 years. They were here, yes, for 300 years, but it was not the same system. Again, it took gradual time for the colonial state to expand. We're going to focus on the top, which is the VOC today, from like the 17th and 18th centuries. And then eventually the duchies Indies will get into it next week. And by 1942, you have the borders of modern Indonesia. The Dutch colonial state is the Indonesian state in terms of territorial integrity. Okay, so let's pivot a bit into geography before we talk a bit more about this, because this is sort of what the Dutch encountered, and not really just the Dutch, all the Europeans really, when they came to this territory. So let's start with maritime Southeast Asia, the so-called Malay world. Why is this important geographically? It's the crossroads. It's the middle ground between what? East Asia and South Asia, and really everything west. If you're a Chinese trader and you want to go to the Middle East, you have to pass through Southeast Asia and vice versa. That's the crucial geographic role of this region, especially before the Americas were discovered. Then you can just go around this. But before, you had to pass through this region. There are also interesting geographical caveats. Say you're a trader from Bengal, Bangladesh. You want to go to, say, China. You can kind of go through here in theory, but this is open ocean. The winds are very violent. Ships don't really make it out alive, or it's much more risky. Where you want to go through is this area. These are inland seas, right? The South China Sea and the Java Sea. And so you have calmer waters, calmer winds. It's much safer. But to get through these parts, you have to pass through this red area, the Straits of Malacca, basically. It's a very narrow choke point in the area. And you can sort of see from satellite imaging how all the ships are just funneled into this very narrow piece of water. And so if you're like a political power in the region, you want to control both sides of the Straits of Malacca. Because once you do, you basically dominate this choke point, and a lot of the trade flowing to the region has to go through it. So that's one element of geography. The next is Java itself, which is it's quite interesting. This is sort of a population density map. Look at how dense Java is compared to everywhere else. Like half of Indonesia's population lives in Java itself. It's not even like, I don't think it's even half. It's like, or even a third of like the landmass. Sorry? This is after 2022. I don't remember the exact year, but it's quite recent. But historically, the same patterns hold. And so why is this the case? Why is Java so weird? Part of the answer is agriculture. Java is spectacularly fertile. Like half of Indonesia's rice production even today is in Java, and it's always been the case. Why is Java so fertile? Okay, Bara up here, he's my old mentor. Bara knows everything, asking about economics, asking about history, asking about even biology and geology too, I guess, in this case. Bara can answer you. He has his Twitter here. I'm just putting him as a plug. I got this slide from Bara, essentially. All of this stuff is from Bara. Thank you, Bara. Shout out to Bara. So why is Java so fertile? Volcanoes. Java has a lot of volcanoes, and not just volcanoes, active volcanoes. And the active part is particularly important because even when they're not exploding, what are they doing? They're showering ash consistently down on Javanese soil, and this makes it remarkably fertile. Another element is that, uh, enjoy the chocolate. Um, Again, we're talking about the equator here, tropical zones, very, very hot, consistently hot. What happens? Organic matter decomposes very, very quickly. Bacteria decomposes organic matter. What do? They release acid. So by default, a lot of the water that you see in this part of the world is quite acidic. It's actually not suitable for growing crops. So what does Java have a lot of? Limestone mountains. The acidic water passes through these limestone formations. The limestone again, it's a base. It dissolves in the water and it neutralizes the acid. It's another factor. Another one, not quite related to fertility, but will have implications as we go forward, is notice in the map, I have two rivers here. Here you have the Bengawan Solo, and here you have the Brantas rivers, two major rivers in Java. Again, where do you have all the fertile soil? It's all inland here. That's where you have all the farms and eventually the plantations. Again, you want to get to the Java Sea, right? That's where you have all the calm waters. That's where you can sort of like ship all your goods out. The rivers connect the inland to the northern coast, to the Java Sea. So you can harvest rice somewhere here in Surakarta, Solo, hop on the boat in the Bengawan Solo, follow it, and before you know it, your goods are out to sea. And that's sort of vital because in this period before modern times, water transport is much more efficient than land transport. So rivers, oceans, key. And that's why the Pasisir Utara, the northern coast of Java, is still quite important economically. Okay, so we've introduced this interesting duality, right, between land and sea. You have the Straits of Malacca and you have Java. And so again, if you're a political power in the arena, you either dominate Java, you build an agrarian sort of state based on Java, or you control the Straits of Malacca, you control maritime trade. This is sort of the duality that you see in this period. And again, the two classical kingdoms and empires of Indonesia, Majapahit and Sriwijaya, they correlate to this too. Majapahit is Javanese, it's land-based, it's agrarian. Sriwijaya is, I think it's from Sumatra, and it's sort of, its source of power is from dominating the Straits of Malacca, more so than agrarian sort of wealth. And this was the world that the Europeans came to, essentially. So why did they come in the first place? Yeah, I'm kind of giving myself away here. I shop in Target. I don't know if that means anything. But yeah, we see. Sorry to the Indonesians. Maybe I should have put an Indonesian, like maybe I should have Indomaret or something. But again, these are staple goods, right? There's coffee, sugar, nutmeg, and again, look at their prices. They're not too bad, right? It's $11 for nutmeg. Pretty affordable. I don't know if anyone saw the WhatsApp blurb for this class. We talked about lattes, right? $6 lattes. $6 is expensive for a latte. Yeah. Well, if you use these prices and you make them yourself, it's even more affordable. But the key story, the key theme I want to drive through here is that it took a long journey to get here historically. Nutmeg wasn't always $11 for a bag. And that story is the story of Indonesia. It's the story of colonial exploitation of the tropics, sorry. And so let's start to unpack that story a little bit. Let's talk about trade for a bit. And I want to argue here that there are two kinds of trade, two kinds of games when you're sort of involved in global trade. And the first is, I have here China, which is basically the biggest exporter of goods today, a big player in global trade. Notice the goods. They're all manufactured goods, complex manufactured goods, right? You have machinery here, you have steel, plastics, automobiles. So complex manufactured goods. Here I have an excerpt from Thomas Mune's book, Discourse on Trade from the 1620s. The major English imports from the East Indies. There were some manufactured goods. Here's silk, calicos or some textiles, usually from Bengal. But notice that these aren't manufactured goods at all. A big chunk of them are raw commodities, right? Pepper, cloves, nutmegs, maces. And these two very different types of goods have two very different sort of like ways of acquiring and production. If you're like China and you're sort of a manufacturer, what do you focus on? Efficient factories, right? Increasing productivity. You increase the quality of the goods. You undercut your competition. You produce them at ever lower prices. It's a very industrial game. Commodities are very different. There's some sophistication with cultivating a coffee plant, but ultimately it's a coffee plant and you just pick the coffee beans, right? It's not sophisticated in the way making a semiconductor is sophisticated. But what's the thing about coffee? It can't grow everywhere. And this becomes even more important, or even more striking example is mineral ores. Cobalt, nickel, you can't find them everywhere. They exist in certain hotspots of the world only. The nickel reserves in Sulawesi or cobalt in the Congo. So if you can somehow control all the cobalt production in the world, say you control the Congo, you control the production of the cobalt, you control all the supply, you control all the distribution, you can charge people whatever you want. So we have two very different games here, right? You can either out-manufacture everyone else, or you can sort of dominate the commodities trade. And again, this is possible in the commodities trade because they don't exist everywhere. So you just have to get to the source. And so this is sort of the game in global trade for most of human history. Here we have a map of trade routes in the 14th century. So notice here, the sort of like the pink stuff and the green stuff. The green stuff are commodities, the pink stuff are, or orange, I guess, are manufactured goods. Notice how most of the manufactured goods are not in Europe. They're in Asia, the Middle East, South Asia, East Asia. And so this was a world where the center of the global economy wasn't Europe, it was Asia. Europe was quite peripheral. What did this mean for Europe? Europe could not compete with the Asian centers in terms of manufacturers. European wool, for example, Spanish wool, for example, could not compete with Bengal textiles. The quality just was not the same. So if you're a European statesman, if you're a European merchant, maybe you should play the commodities game instead, because the manufacturing game is kind of hard to win. And the stakes were pretty high with the commodities game. Again, remember all of these trades flowing from the east to Europe. They all had to pass through the Ottomans and the Mamluks. These were Islamic sultanates at the time. And so what would happen? The Ottomans could charge the Europeans however they wanted to, because all of the goods had to pass through the Ottoman Empire. And the middlemen of the Ottomans, the Venetians, for example, also became filthy rich. Because again, if you wanted to buy goods coming through the Ottoman Empire, you had to buy them from a Venetian. And so if you're European, if you're from Western Europe, you might think, is there a way to get around them? Is there a way to get around the Ottomans? And that was essentially what motivated the age of exploration. Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese explorer, he sets out and he rounds the Cape of Good Hope. He basically bypasses the Ottomans. And with that, he gets direct access to the trade of the East. You don't have to pay the Ottomans their fees anymore. Consequently, Ottoman and especially Venetian power started to decline after that. So now we're in this new world where Europe is establishing its own direct maritime trade routes with the Americas, which was recently discovered, but also with Asia. And again, with the commodities trade, monopoly is the key word, right? You dominate the good at its source. You dominate the commodity at its source. You dominate its production. You dominate its distribution, and you can charge everyone whatever you want. You eliminate all competition. That's the name of the game. And Sukarno is quite explicit about this. He mentions, like straight out, basically that old imperialism, imperialisme tua, in the 17th and 18th centuries, was driven by the construction of these monopolistic systems. And he talks about three specific examples in Indonesia. The spice trade in Maluku, the subjugation of Makassar, and sort of divide and conquer policies in Java. And we'll talk about all of those today. So what was the main allure? What was the main commodity? Spices, nutmeg and cloves. Again, Remember the target prices, right? A bag of spices was what, $10, $11? That wasn't the case back then. A pound of nutmeg was more expensive than a pound of gold at this time. Look at the profit margins in the 1720s. This was in the Bengal marketplace, 4,300% for nutmeg. We're gonna look at a lot of crazy things that the Dutch and the Europeans did. You're going to start asking, why did they go to these lands? 4,300%. That's why. And I started thinking, like, why was nutmeg so valued in Europe? I try to think of food that uses nutmeg in Europe. It's eggnog. I can only think of eggnog. I love eggnog, but like I don't think eggnog is 4,000%. Um, Turns out it wasn't for culinary uses. It's for drugs and medicinal. There's this charming excerpt from like a herbology text in charming Old English, where it says that nutmegs cause a sweet breath and the mendos that do stink. Another one is good against freckles in the face. It quickens the flight, strengthens the belly and the feeble liver. And yeah, you get the picture. It's almost a miracle drug. Maybe the modern analogy would be something like rhinoceros horn in traditional Chinese medicine, or manuka honey. It's like a bottle, $500. It cures everything. What do you mean by everything? I don't know. People buy it anyway. It's the same thing. It's basically like an exotic good. Oh, perfect. Even better. It's a drug too. Thank you. Yeah, so that's sort of, again, that's why it's so valued at the time. Okay, so let's start to look at the actual European incursion in the Indies. So the first Europeans to arrive weren't the Dutch, they were the Portuguese. Again, the Portuguese were the first to open up the trade routes through the Cape of Good Hope. And initially, they didn't even know where to find these spices. You kind of knew it was in this area. That's where you had cloves and nutmeg, but you don't even really know this exact location. At the time, there was a major maritime power called Malacca, the Sultanate of Malacca. And in the 15th century, they basically dominated the trade in the region. Why? Again, they were able to control both sides of the Straits of Malacca. By dominating that, they dominated the trade. The Portuguese came, they saw that, and they're like, I want that. And so what did they do? They sacked Malacca. But things didn't go as planned because they conquered Malacca, but they weren't able to become the new center of trade. Because turns out it's not just geography that matters, it's networks. Why was Malacca so important and rich? Yes, because of its location, but also why? Because traders, financiers, producers, all these important financial people, all these important economic actors, they all centered in Malacca. And that's not easy to replicate. Think of New York. New York is economically important partly because of its location, but also because all of the banks, all of the companies, all of the schools, all of the talent that you have in New York. If you conquer New York, but all of these people scatter to the winds, you don't have New York. It's gone. And that's exactly what happened here. And this is an important point to remember as we sort of go forward. Networks are not easy to build. What ended up happening then was power was diffused across the region. You didn't have one big player. Again, you had all sorts of players vying for control of the maritime trade routes in the region. And I kind of want to make a comment about sort of, there's this narrative, this myth almost that, at the time it was the locals against the Europeans. The locals fought against the Europeans. That's not the most accurate perception of the dynamic here. Because for the locals, the Europeans were just one competitor among many. If you're Mataram and say you don't like Banjarmasin, and the English are willing to help you against Banjarmasin, you'll ally with the English. And so no one liked each other. Everyone was fighting against each other. The Europeans were just one more player among many. And eventually they would dominate the region, but not yet at this point. There's often this myth that it's not a myth, there's some truth to it, where they came with guns and we fought them off with like bamboo sticks. That wasn't quite true yet. At this point, the technological disparity wasn't quite as wide yet. And so even if there was any advanced sailing or military tactics that Europeans brought in, the local powers actually copied them pretty quickly. Okay, so let's turn to the Dutch. There's sort of this very vicious cycle that's introduced by monopoly dynamics. Because imagine you're the Dutch government or you're a Dutchman, and then you see the Portuguese trying to monopolize the spice trade to Europe. You realize at some point, if I let them do this, I have to pay the Portuguese the amount they charge. How do I avoid that? I have to build my own monopoly. And so the moment one guy tries to build a monopoly, everyone else is like, I have to do the same thing. Otherwise, they're going to screw me over. So that's what the Dutch did. Not just the Dutch, but all the other European powers, the Spanish, the English, the French, all of them felt this pressure to monopolize or be monopolized, essentially. And the Dutch's engine for doing this was the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. And again, how it was formed is quite telling, right? You had at the time 4 different Dutch companies in the region. They were all competing. The Dutch government basically forced them to merge. Why? Because you want to build your own monopoly. You don't want competition. And the best way to do this is with this mega company that's consolidated. Another interesting note is that the VOC is in many ways the world's first multinational and joint stock company. Joint stock, like it was like publicly listed on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, I think. And again, it's obviously multinational because it was sort of Dutch, but it also had like territory in South Asia and the Indies. So in many ways, this is the ancestor to the modern corporation. Again, remember Sukarno, imperialism and capitalism. It's quite telling that the handmaiden of Dutch colonialism is multinational corporation, essentially. Okay, so let's go into the spice trade. So we have a chain of islands in the eastern part of Indonesia called Maluku, or at the time, the Europeans called it the Moluccas. And this was the only place in the world where nutmeg and cloves were produced. And that's part of the reason why it was so expensive. This was the only place where you can source this thing. And because it was so profitable, again, competition was intense. All the Europeans, but also local powers. And everyone was trying to establish their own monopoly. And the primary way foreign powers tried to do this was through something called a monopoly agreement. So essentially, you go to a nutmeg or a clove producer and you tell them, you only get to sell your stuff to me at a specific price. But obviously, everyone tried to undercut each other. So you try to establish a monopoly agreement. Someone's like, oh, yeah, sure, they sign, and they go behind your back. Or there's a smuggler who sort of tries to like undercut you. So competition was very intense, and everyone's were sort of playing against each other. So what happens when this game goes nowhere? This monopoly agreement game. You try to do it again and again and again, and no one really listens to you, but you have to build the monopoly. How do you do it? Well, you can do something extreme, like the Banda massacres. And so again, Banda, it's this almost very tiny archipelago. It's hard to spot even within this like cluster of islands. But in this very small, almost conspicuous archipelago, you could find nutmeg. And this was the source of nutmeg. This was where you could get those 4,000% margins. And the Bandanese themselves were skilled traders. They sort of have been peddling this trade for many, many years. The problem, though, at least for the Europeans, was that Banda had a very decentralized social organization. You had all these different villages and you had all these village chiefs instead of one sultan. Why was this tricky? If you had one sultan, you beat him, you impose an agreement on him, done. But if you have like dozens and dozens of villages, you can't subjugate them all. So what do? You come in and you kill them all, essentially. So over a 10-year period, the VOC comes in and they massacre the Bandanese. The population of the island was 15,000 when they started. When it ended, it was less than 1,000. This is extinction level event. An entire society wiped out. And you bring in compliant labor. You bring in slaves. And again, so this was the essence of monopoly at its most extreme, at its most costly, at its most puritanical. And why did they do this? Again, 4,000%. That's why they did this. And it didn't stop there. Once you establish the system, you want to maintain it. Because if even one Englishman enters Banda, smuggles out a nutmeg seed and plants it somewhere else, your monopoly is broken. Because now the English can grow their own nutmeg trees. So smuggling, harshly punished. And even there was this practice of dousing all the seeds and all the trees in lime, so that like even when you ship the seeds out, they were basically sterile. You couldn't like plant them and they wouldn't grow. So those were the lengths that the Dutch went to. And a little bit of a fun fact. At one point, the English conquered an island in the Bandas called Run, and the Dutch were very desperate to get Run back. So they signed an agreement, the Treaty of Breda, where Run was to be exchanged with the English for another island. It's called New Amsterdam, New York. So interesting coincidence. Just to end the story, the Dutch could not keep this up forever. Eventually, a French trader smuggled out a bunch of nutmeg seeds, and you have in this picture on the left nutmeg trees being grown in Ceylon, Sri Lanka. So eventually, once you did that, that's it. No more monopoly. Anyone can grow nutmeg, and that's how you get it at $10 instead of whatever that price was. Again, it doesn't stop there. You have to maintain monopoly. We talk about smuggling, how smuggling was a very big problem. Smugglers need bases to operate from, right? Naval bases. One of those bases was Makassar, which is a sort of like a regional power at the time. And so other powers, the Makassaris themselves, but also other Europeans who wanted to smuggle and disrupt the Dutch trade would operate from Makassar. So what do? You crush Makassar. And it's quite telling how the Dutch did this. The Dutch were allied with other locals from Sulawesi, the Goans, essentially. This very famous war leader, Arung Palaka, that's his name, and this is basically him on this picture. So the Dutch deployed Arung Palaka against the Makassaris because the Goans had their own rivalry. And eventually the same Goans would aid the Dutch when they were operating in Java. And again, there's this narrative. They divided the Indonesians. How could Indonesians fight against each other? Well, because they didn't see themselves as Indonesians. Arung Palaka did not have any sense of national kinship with the Makassaris. It was not betrayal. It was just power competition at that time between rival states. Again, it didn't stop in Makassar, though. It's the thing about monopoly. It keeps going, it keeps going, it keeps going. And that's what brought the Dutch eventually to Java. And again, with all of these operations going around, you needed a permanent base. Ambon was too far from the Straits of Malacca. Java was closer. And then they picked a site, and they raised the existing village, drove out the locals, and they established Batavia, Jakarta. That was to be the center of Dutch rule. And Java was important for other reasons too. Again, remember, Java is fertile. And if you have sailors, you have soldiers, you have merchants, you have traders, you need to feed them. Where do you get the rice? Java. You need to build ships. Where do you get the timber? Java. But just as how involvement in Banda sort of drew the Dutch to Makassar, now that they were in Java, they also got involved in Javanese politics. At that time, the dominant power in Java was the Mataram Sultanate. And so whenever the sons of the kings of the Mataram Sultanate would fight against each other, the Dutch would just get involved. And so you kind of see like almost this vicious cycle, like this spiraling involvement where the Dutch got pulled deeper and deeper and deeper into sort of local politics. And again, so far, we've been talking about maritime trade routes. Again, remember the duality, land and sea, Majapahit and Sriwijaya, Java and the outer islands. Initially, we were just focusing on the spice route, right? The spice trade routes all the way from Ambon and sort of Maluku here, all the way to the west. Now the Dutch would get more and more involved in Java, and we'll start to see land start to come into play. And land is not going to exist independently from sea, because as we'll see in the coming weeks, the Dutch are basically going to try to turn Java into a giant plantation for growing export crops. So let me end with a bunch of theoretical notes. So the VOC, was it a corporation? Was it a company or was it a state? Right? Because it's sort of, again, it's obviously a company. It's profit-oriented, structured like a company, but it also kind of functioned like a government, like a state. It conquered these territories, it administered them. There's the scholar Arthur Westin basically posits that it's both. It's a company state. Company, again, for all the reasons we established, but also a state because the business model of this company required it to conquer and hold territory. What's your business model? Monopolize the spice trade. Well, that means I have to conquer Banda. I have to hold that, and I have to basically manage the production of Banda. And so that's one point. And this has important implications. The Singaporean, I think, Kui Hui Kian, she writes that, again, because it's a corporation, it wants to do this at the lowest cost. And you can't just bring everyone you need from the Netherlands. It's basically the other side of the world. So what do? You use locals. And so that's what the VOC did. It deployed Mataram elites. It deployed Bupatis. It deployed Chinese merchants. And you start to see how there was this complex web. Someone talked about elite co-optation in the WhatsApp group. You start to see the start of it. Although here, it started out more so as like competition and pitting them against each other. And remember what we talked about, it's hard to build networks. And so instead of building one from scratch, the Dutch just basically using the existing network, which was this network of local elites. And really, by this point, even though it was still the VOC, it was still this corporation, all the basic elements of the colonial state are already in place. Profit maximization, co-optation of local elites, and some kind of system where you guarantee the acquisition of commodities. Today we focus on spices. Today we focus on cloves and nutmeg. Next week, it's sugar and coffee, and more and more and more and more commodities. And this was a vicious cycle. Because generally, how do you secure, again, remember the Banda massacres, how do you secure these commodities? Violence, coercion. Usually, the violence and coercion led to a revolt. And then the VOC comes in, tries to quash the revolt. What happens? They end up bankrupt. They're bankrupt. They need more commodities, more coercion, more revolts. It's a vicious cycle, and it sort of kept drawing the Dutch deeper and deeper and deeper into what we would now call Indonesia, and eventually would bankrupt them. So that's it for today. I have a sneak peek for the Saturday. It's our first guest speaker of our sort of class thing. Professor Peter Carey, Indonesians probably know him. He's a British historian, and he focuses on the Java War. This conflict that broke out in 1830, I think. And one of its central figures, Prince Pangeran Diponegoro. He even translated the Babat Diponegoro from Javanese to, was it Indonesian or English? The Babat Diponegoro. To what? To English or to Indonesian? Oh, you only have Germans, okay. Yeah, so next week this Saturday is going to be talking about the Java War in particular. And the interesting thesis is that this conflict was in some ways brought, at the time, you had two revolutions happening in the West, the French and the industrial. And basically the Java War was what brought these revolutions to Indonesia and overthrew essentially what Peter Carey would call the old order in Java. And I think we're going to structure it as a discussion, right? It's going to be a Q&A. Yeah. Yeah, Professor Carey is going to be live streaming from Indonesia, so it's all going to be on Zoom. We're not going to meet in this room, so just wait. No. Yeah. We'll post it on WhatsApp. Don't worry. Yeah. So while they discuss logistics, yes. Yeah, we have it. It's on the WhatsApp already. We'll repost it. Don't worry about timing. But yeah, that's it for today. Thank you, everyone. I'll open it up to discussion, Q&As as usual. Anyone wants to chime in?
I have a question, Pak.
Yeah.
So, so when you research about Sukarno and how he defines imperialism, capitalism, etc., does he mention anything about Papua? Because like Indonesia itself at that time, or like around that time, are probably becoming the perpetrator, or even as of now?
Well, Sukarno, I think that's the stuff we were talking about. That's 1930 Indonesian
Oh, okay.
Menggugat. So that wasn't even before. So
Mm.
the Indonesian state had not come to being yet at the time. So I don't think he mentioned it. He only mentions Papua in the context of Bovendigul, the concentration camp, which at the time was so infamous that he even turned it into a verb. Orang-orang ini didigulkan. They were digulized, essentially. But I think that's the only reference he makes at this point. Yeah.
When you showed all the independence pamphlets, whatever, they were all Dutch titles. Were they written in Dutch?
Yeah, so let me go back.
And who's the audience? Are they only the elites, like educated Dutch educated?
Essentially. Yeah, so I think Narda Republic, again, continue the theme of the past several weeks. It's sort of this idea of between worlds, right? And sort of that these were very Dutch, steeped in Dutch culture, steeped in Dutch education. They were mostly writing, as you sort of alluded to other Dutchified Indonesians, essentially. Narda Republic is interesting. I think Tan Malaka wrote it originally in Dutch, but eventually got translated pretty quickly to both English and Malay. For specifically these two, Indonesia Vrij and Indonesia Klatan, they were both court cases. So both Hatta and Sukarno were sort of dragged in front of Dutch courts. Sukarno in Indonesia itself, and Hatta was in the Netherlands, I think. I don't know if it was Leiden or Amsterdam, but that would explain why they were in Dutch, because they're sort of defending themselves in Dutch courts.
They did trickle down to like Dutch somehow, like were there like newspaper?
Yeah. I don't think so. I don't think so actually. I think take this with a grain of salt. I'm just sort of recollecting scraps from memory. But by this time, the Dutch were already becoming quite repressive, even on press organs. So, I actually didn't mention this. Remember Minke from several weeks ago? He eventually ends up establishing the first Indonesian basically newspaper, Indonesian run newspaper, Medan Priayi. Minke himself is sort of based on Tirto Adisuryo, who's the actual founder of Medan Priayi. And Minke in the book and also Tirto Adisuryo in real life were both eventually imprisoned by the Dutch, and Medan Priayi was shut down. So like press control was quite severe as well at this time.
Two quick thoughts. First one, like just a fun read if anyone's interested. You were talking about Sukarno's autobiography earlier, which was written or ghostwritten by Cindy Adams. There's also a fun like complementary book to that I really enjoy, and it's called My Friend the Dictator, and it's written by Cindy Adams, and it's her reflections on writing that autobiography. It's like a meta reflection, and it's funny. It's really funny. It's really fun. It's very lively with like her life in Jakarta. Also, like the woman's still alive. She lives across the park. Like she's 90 something in New York. But that's a really fun book if anyone's just interested in that. The second thing that I thought of is earlier when you were talking, when you opened up evening, you were talking about like different revolutions and such. I haven't read this book. I'm curious if others have and have thoughts on this, but Vincent Bevins, I think, who wrote the Jakarta Method, like his newer book is about, it's called like If We Burn or something, and it's about a decade of revolutions, but why have they not led to anything essentially? So he like analyzes like Arab Spring, even things like BLM, and I think from what my friends have told me, the argument is like, okay, how does media today, how does social media, how does like modern police repression differ from a lot of these revolutions that we learn about, especially in the 40s to 60s? I haven't read it, but I'm curious if other people have thoughts as it relates to some of the things we talk about here.
Anyone on Zoom? Anyone on Zoom?
Or just a pin for the future. Yeah.
It's for the next class.
I have to revisit. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's a different a software title. Yeah. Because I have a copy that's literally like My Friend the Dictator, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, there was I can't speak too much about repression, but an interesting supplement to that might be, I forgot what's the name of the book. I don't know if Brian's in the chat. He was the one who recommended it to me. It was about the Singaporean underground, essentially, as to how Singapore became meeting ground for various nationalists. You know what? Yeah, Tim Harper, I think was the name of the author. Yeah, we can put it in the group. We can put it in the group. And really, but yeah, the argument was basically that none of these revolutions happen in isolation. They were talking, and we'll actually see that in a few weeks where Sukarno, he refers to Sun Yat-sen, he refers to Gandhi, he refers specifically to Satyagraha even, the Swadeshi movement in India. So they were all sort of informing each other. Yeah. In the Pan-African movement. I can't recall anyone. He did mention the Pan-Islamists. He talks about Jamal al-Din al-Afghani. He talks about Muhammad Abduh, Rashid Rida, but I don't remember. He definitely engaged with them eventually in the Bandung conference in 55. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't remember from the text I've read, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were somehow connected or in contact, even if indirect.
Yes, but we haven't talked about the other players who are non-locals.
Mm.
What about the Arabs? What about the Chinese? What about like you said, maybe the Moroccans, like the Indians, the South Asians, like any other players who's also in the area? Because Europe is just one player, right? And they are dominating it, but because I had a professor in undergrad where his whole research is him trying to prove when Islam exactly came to Indonesia. And then because the consensus was it's because of trade, because of like intermarriages, whatnot. But then he discovered graveyard markers. And if you know Arabic, is that Arabic itself usually it doesn't have the what's it called diacritic marks, like the fatha, the kasra, the damatain, like the one that makes you learn a e u, but also the dots. That's an added. It wasn't there before. So he discovered in those in the grave markers they don't have dots. They don't have like if you have like a ba, there's a dot like right below, like they don't have those. So that means that Islam came even before the Arabic script has dots. Because if you look at the grave markers, right? So it's interesting to see that it's not just like how does part that like we don't know. We haven't found more evidence, but if you think about it, like there's just so much we haven't discovered yet, or like how much they actually like were in play in this Monopoly game.
Right. And it's also I didn't include this from Kian, but she writes makes interesting points about Chinese and Arab and Indian traders as being major players in the region even before the Europeans came. And again, the reason why is quite straightforward. Again, if who are the big powers, who are the big consumers, who are the big markets at the time? It's China, it's East Asia, and also South Asia. And so both Indians and Chinese have already established all of these networks of traders down to Nusantara, so to speak. And the goods are interesting because the goods are very different from the goods that the Europeans are trading. And I don't remember the goods that Indian and Arab traders dealt with, but the Chinese, it was sea cucumbers and bird nest. And back to the sort of theme of like exotic medicines and that cost an exorbitant amount. Bird's nest, it doesn't taste like anything. It's the saliva that a swallow spits out to construct its nest. And basically it's thought to be therapeutic in Chinese medicine. It's very labor intensive. Like you take in the nest and like you have to pick out all the shards and the feathers by hand. And that's why it's so expensive. But it's sort of an interesting observation. Another one was also that Kian sort of asks why the Chinese traders weren't as edged out as the Indian and Arab traders. It was because the Chinese weren't competing for the same trade routes with the Dutch. Because the Chinese, they were dealing with the China to Indonesia trade route, the east to west. West to east. Whereas the Indians and the Arabs were competing on the same trade route with the Europeans, which is the trade all the way from the West, from Europe to Indonesia, essentially. And that's why the Chinese are sort of like, we're sort of like deployed, we're sort of survived. Chinese traders survived in a more robust way under the Dutch. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I know why I did that. Yeah. So again, if you're a Chinese trader, this route, right? And if you're an Indian trader, it's this route. The Europeans were also on the same route as the Indian and Arab traders, whereas the Europeans at the time, at least the Dutch, were not as concerned with the China-Indonesia trade. And so that's why the Chinese sort of survived more as a merchant class.
Wanted trade agency, because
Yes.
I remember on the other page way back, showing the English trade registry, so much of it was silk. And they needed that.
Yes. They could not replicate. I think there was an episode Kian described where they tried to completely cut out the Chinese traders and it just didn't work. The system almost collapsed, essentially. They were systemically important, even before the Dutch came. So
Where is that located?
if I recall, it's the eastern part of Java, Pasuruan, I think.
This anecdote, last year, I told someone else from Indonesia, Chinese person, they asked me, can you bring bird's nest back?
Oh.
Apparently they still have this. I didn't know what they were saying.
Yeah. Well, I think today you can find them in Jakarta as well. So
But is it also consumed by Indonesians?
Yeah.
Indonesian
sarang burung.
Chinese,
Yes.
yes.
Wallet.
I don't know about
Wallet. Yeah,
Indonesian.
sarang burung wallet.
It's very expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alsha's rich.
Or someone has
Usually
a
for medicine though.
When you.
There's someone in the chat.
someone in the chat.
Something in the chat.
It's from Robbie Dwicky. I just knew about the Banda massacre and how it happened on 17th century. We can argue that, why am I doing this? I can just put it on the screen. Wait, let me share the screen. Chat. Okay, there we go. But you can argue that colonialism doesn't happen for some years. Yeah. Does anyone feel the same way? Any Indonesians feel the same way?
Yeah.
Wait, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Oh, you want me to read it? Not tired of hearing me for the past hour? Oh, yeah.
The slaves that were brought to Banda, were they from other parts of Indonesia?
Yeah. There was this whole like we're familiar with the triangular trade, like the Atlantic slave trade. There was something similar that happened. It's been a while since I read it, but I think the way it worked was Sukarno had that quote, right? Let me see if I can pull it up. Wait. Right here, where like the hundreds of thousands of Makassaris who, losing their livelihoods, were forced to become roving pirates. And the Makassaris at the time were some of the most, the Bugis and Makassar specifically, were some of the most sort of renowned warriors in the region. They were fierce fighters. And so once they sort of like a lot of these kingdoms fell, they became pirates. And some of the things that they pirated were humans. And so they were involved in the slave trade as well. They would raid other territories in Indonesia and sort of sell these people as slaves. But again, even before the Dutch came, like slavery was already present. Yeah.
From Makassar, I was thinking about how even because they don't have the concept of what an Indonesian is, right? But we have sultanates, kingdoms, and Makassaris and the Goanese are pretty much like fighting each other. But then, because I'm not from Makassar, so I don't know. But I do grew up in Bogor, which is a region of Sunda. So we always hear somebody who's like, if there's this tale of a Sundanese princess. You guys must have remembered it for the Indonesians in the room. The Sundanese princess who was forced to get married to a Japanese prince, but then yes, and then because like she doesn't want to, and then there was fighting, she killed herself rather than rather than marry him. So then even now, people say like, I heard the elders told the young Sundanese girls, don't marry a Japanese man. Like it's not, like don't marry Japanese men. So it still existed, and this is way before colonization, way before 1600s. Like this is where like the kingdom of like the Hinduist Buddhism kingdom are still like prevalent, right? So I was just wondering, like, does or the Makassaris or the Goanis in the
Kearifan lokal yang tidak arif.
Because that was interesting. I was thinking, like, oh, they might be not fighting because they don't have the concept of what an Indonesian is or whatnot. But well, the Japanese princess and the Japanese prince and the princess.
Yeah.
Maybe in the chat somebody
Yeah.
who's from Makassar.
Yeah.
Or from Goa. Oh, there's a
Anyone?
question on the chat.
Oh, let me pull it up for everyone. Wait, oh. It's not- things of Portuguese. That's a good question. I don't actually know if the Portuguese employed it.
Oh,
Maha,
Portuguese
yeah.
part.
Yeah,
In Maluku.
in Banda Island,
Oh, in Banda.
Yeah.
they did build the fort, and also like in Jakarta. I mean, like we have this fort like since 1500s. So that's why we cannot argue that the colonization started like in 250 years, because like they built fort, they want to replace us, they want to collect,
Right. Yeah, I would say as a general rule of thumb, most of the European powers operating in the region, because of just distance and logistics, you had to deploy natives essentially. As a general rule of thumb. That is. Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. Let me turn on the speaker first. Okay, it's gonna echo the moment I do this. Okay, go. Sharon? Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
Echo.
Sorry. Is it okay now?
Yeah.
Okay, so my question is, I forgot which slide was it, but there was a slide showing on the 17th century, like the European was basically just another player on the region. But I'm wondering though, if you said like European was just another player in the region, does it mean the local at the time already conducting their economic system like the European? Because what I learned from school is the reason, like what I learned from like history of like art history of Eastern Europe is that the Dutch was particularly unique because they were Calvinists like at that time. So which is like kind of like the birth of capitalism, because the Calvinists they collect wealth as means to satiate their anxiety, because they don't rely on the church anymore to access God. So how do they know that the gods love them back? Through hard work and amassing amount, like lots of wealth. This is why, like, how do you call it? Like at that time, it was like the Dutch was unique, right? Because they were like free state, but they were under the Spanish Holy Roman Empire, and then the Spanish want to but then they were rebelling against the Spanish, like they don't want to be Catholic anymore, and then so then they become like Calvinists. So then they create this Dutch East Indies companies basically to fight the Spain back. So then the middle class raises, and then they, from this colonial venture, they like amass, like gain lots of wealth, but then they don't spend their wealth, unlike the Spanish, when they like steal all the gold from the South America. So I'm wondering, because is it fair to say it, if like we say the Dutch at the time, like in this Southeast Asia region, just like another player? Because I'm not sure if the local at that times already have that mindset, like, just to like, because at it, or is it already, you know what I mean? It's like, because like collecting wealth just for the sake of wealth itself, it's a very Calvinist, like it's the Calvinists who started it, which is the Dutch.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's sort of sounds like Weber's argument, I think, with the Protestant work ethic. Yeah, I agree with you in the sense that there's this distinction that you draw, right, between like sort of a capitalist and a pre-capitalist society. And we'll actually cover that next week. We'll be talking about one of the, not Marx necessarily, but Karl Polanyi. He's an economic historian, and he talks about the formation of market society. And so it gets a similar idea about there's this distinction between pre-capitalist and capitalist sort of societies and modes of production. And really the challenge for the Dutch the next week is, how do you take a pre-capitalist society and turn it capitalist, essentially? And so you're right on that point. I think on an objective basis, on a sociological level, yes, the Europeans were quite different. And really the biggest signs of that, as you mentioned, like different motives, profit maximization, that's one of them. And that's sort of embedded in this fact that this wasn't a sultanate. This wasn't like the VOC wasn't a sultanate, right? It wasn't a mandala. It wasn't a kingdom. It was a corporation. You're absolutely right about that. I think the point that I wanted to highlight here was simply that in the grand scheme of like power politics, I don't think I don't know what they thought about the Dutch. I don't know if they were like, oh, lighter skin. I don't know if that was what was going on in their heads, but but in terms of like, who do I hate politically? Who do I want to ally with politically? I don't think the players here really distinguish between the Europeans, and it wasn't like Mataram and Makassar are like, we're part of the same region, and then we should ban against the Dutch. Not necessarily that they weren't like, they didn't have a privileged place of association compared to the Dutch. So that was more so the point I was going for here, but I think you're absolutely right. I think sociologically speaking, these are very different powers. So we have more questions, I think. Let me pull up chat again. There's a Spice Road expedition. Thank you if anyone wants to check that out. So a book recommendation. Thank you. Especially. Yeah, yeah. This is an interest. Yeah. AGR and AGR. I think if the Nobel Prize. Yeah, Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson. The Why Nations Fail. It was a very, I forget what was the thesis. It was someone called it Whiggish materialism, in the sense of like how Marx has his dialectic materialism, where sort of everything inevitably leads to a communist society, and AGR is like everything eventually leads to like liberal societies with free markets, essentially, because that's what boosts innovation. And I think, yeah, I think it's sort of like one of their landmark papers where I don't know if there are any economists here who want to correct me. If I remember correctly, it was about calculating soldier mortality rates in the settler colonies. So essentially, in those colonies where like the mortality rates of like settlers were of like basically Europeans were lower, those became settler colonies instead of extractive colonies. Because again, if you take the Americas, parts of it are very population dense, like the modern day Peru, that's the Inca Empire, modern day Mexico. And so those became extractive, basically colonies, whereas parts of North America, which were less population dense, less soldiers died there because there was less people, and those became settler colonies. And then he sort of linked that to which countries had better economies. The big critique, though, of that is that he doesn't look at them from a systems perspective. America is richer than, say, Indonesia, but maybe America's wealth is dependent on Indonesia's poverty. That's sort of like the counter argument that some people put, which AGR doesn't really talk about. I don't know if that's a good summary of AGR, but that's what I remember. Yeah, the Adam Smith part is also very interesting. Adam Smith, one of his opening lines is that it is in man's proper nature to truck and barter. It's human nature to want to exchange things, to want to barter and trade. And I think like that was sort of what was attacked by a lot of other non-orthodox sort of economists. Yeah. Yes, this is actually good. Actually, I completely forgot about this. Extractive versus inclusive. This is exactly like, yeah, this is exactly like, yeah, I don't know why I didn't start with this, but essentially, yeah. And that's sort of like also, it's quite, it's actually orthodox belief in a lot of economic circles as well, that, well, I don't know if a lot of economic circles, but economists that I know in Indonesia, at least the ones I've interacted with, like quite a big chunk of them agree with this thesis, which is essentially that why is Indonesia still poor? Well, because Indonesia is still digging up coal and palm oil instead of like moving up and producing cars, producing smartphones. So this sort of framework of extractive versus inclusive is still quite kind of pertinent.
The powers that benefit from
Right. Yes. 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 Yes, yes, that's the proper, yeah, that's actually the proper distinction. I kind of just jumped ahead and sort of drew the economic correlation, but yeah, that's the essence of it. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Anyone want to say anything else? Any questions? Yeah.
Relates to the previous point that, sorry, I don't know your name, but you made, Rachel, you made about like how revolution is different now than it was previously. And I can't help but think about like the fact of like how information is just so abundant and decentralized these days. So what was your opinion on it? Our forefathers' revolution, like dependent on information still being much harder to access for it to be sustainable? Because like I would imagine if Sukarno were to make Indonesia Menggugat now, when people's attention spans are already like very low due to TikTok and everything, it wouldn't be so effective now, right? So yeah, the fact that information was just not abundant played a big part in there being like revolutions back then. And is it what's causing revolutions to not happen anymore? Because now like even like BLM or any other movement, it gets fractured so easily because like every time there's something new, everyone has an opinion about it, and then it becomes like multiple different like factions for the same thing. So I want to get your take on that.
Yeah, in terms of communications and media, the main tool at this time was the radio. And we're covering Indonesia Menggugat because I think it's sort of it's like the think piece, I guess. But I think when you're looking at mass mobilization, it was probably Sukarno's speeches which were broadcasted to the public. Those were the more decisive things. And the repression part is interesting because the Dutch severely repressed the nationalist movement. So for big chunks of its existence, it actually could not connect with the masses. And we'll talk about this in a few weeks. And this is why the Japanese would be decisive, because it was the Japanese.
Not as the masses, so that it had like that
But-
time, like
They wouldn't have bodies if that's the
that
case.
is
There's an interesting book by Riane Subianto, Communication Against Capital, The Red Enlightenment at the Dawn of the Nation. And what I find interesting is one of the chapters she discussed is because of how the red movement, Gerakan Merah, how they operate, is literally people who are illiterate. You go and you cover there and they would read to the people who are illiterate, to the farmers, to the people who can't read. And then people would listen to the radio and translate it back. And you remember like how we like in Indonesian history, how you got and how the Japanese is how we got our independence because somebody, what's his name? He was listening to the radio real
Right.
close, and then he was like, "Oh my God, yeah, we're independent now" or something. I forgot which one. What's that guy name? But anyway, so I think it. Yes, I think so. That's what I mean. Like, movement needs bodies at the end of the day. It doesn't like you need bodies, and bodies now. I feel like it's more decisive because people are more. Can I say that people are more? They have more rights in the sense that they have more rights in the sense that, for example, if you were somebody who can't read, or you can't read Dutch, or you can't read Japanese, or you can't read English, but now you're able to do so because of the spread of media now, where it's whenever you look at or not, you have to at least learn English. You have to at least learn some other language. Like, does that make sense? Like, I felt like now people are a lot more critical, not sometimes good, sometimes bad in terms of processing media. That's why it's harder for movement and their bodies to just stay in the movement. And then that's also like more discursive, more like frictions against one another. But I wouldn't necessarily say
Okay,
it's
okay.
because of that.
I just want to add that sort of what you mentioned, this was actually one of the debates in the nationalist movement, and it was between Soekarno and Hatta. So we had two PNIs, Partai Nasionalis Indonesia, the Indonesian Nationalist Party, and no, that's PPI, actually, never mind. Partai Pendidikan Indonesia. And that was Hatta and Sultan Syahrir. And they disagreed exactly in the way you sort of anticipated. Sukarno was essentially with Sukarno was like, we have to rouse the masses. And that was very much partly because he was like, I'm the great leader of the revolution. I'm the artistic man. I can like move the masses. And Hatta and Syahrir were more like, we should build educated cadres slowly. And that was like one of the points where, so when Sukarno founded the PNI and he started agitating, Hatta and Syahrir did not like it at all. Because they're like, then the Dutch are just going to crack down on us. So this was one of the debates that was being waged at that time.
Indonesia is a failure. It was a failure. I mean, like, was a defense statement when got onto trial as his defense. So, yeah, that's why he was like, I am, and Indonesia is me, right? I mean, like, he wants to put a strong defense against the Dutch. So, yeah.
Yes.
And very sensational too, which is very
It
like
was
him.
sensational.
Very
I mean, like,
sensational.
when it first came out, it's not that sensational because like only part of us, I mean, like the one that were in the room that knows about that, but we like kita menggemakan itu, akhirnya kita translate itu ke dalam bahasa Melayu, bahasa Jawa, and then everyone knows about Indonesia Menggugat.
It got disseminated and circulated.
Yeah.
I'm interested inspired by the Dreyfus affair, Jacques Urian. Like the front page was like, how that article was.
That's an interesting point. I don't know actually, but that's an interesting point. I would have to look that up.
I would think because he's in like the Dutch schools.
Yeah, a good starting point would be you look up his autobiography with Cindy Adams and Control F Dreyfus and see if it pops up. Because he's very generous with like his influences. He mentions like I was influenced. He likes talking about himself. So there's a lot to mine in his autobiography. We want to cut it short? Oh, okay. You wanna end things? How's everyone doing? You wanna keep going? You wanna? Okay, I think. Oh, it is PNI, Pendidikan Nasional Indonesia. Thank you. So two pennies. But okay. To make sure we don't all get burned out, I think I'm gonna end it here. Thank you so much, everyone. As usual, we'll see you on Saturday and next week.